Greetings! This video will be about starting with watercolor paints. I was in the store one day facing the displays for hundreds of little tubes of paint, and I realized that even if I was familiar with all of this, it was still pretty confusing. Then I remembered about the paints I bought duplicates from multiple brands because I didn't know any better, or some of the sets I bought that ended up being kind of a bad choice. Same with brushes and paper. It is pretty intimidating at the very start. I wanted to contribute this way of starting with the medium based on my current knowledge and past mistakes. If you turned into the watercolor aisle, got scared and then ran away, I hope this will help you. What I want to do in this first video is give some pointers in the selection of the most basic supplies you'd need to try watercolors. We are talking very first try, the one that might decide whether this is for you or not. I'll talk brushes, papers, paints, and other supplies. We'll also get our tools ready for painting. Brushes. Here are some of the brands you can look for. Royal and Langnickel Zen, ProArte Polar or Proline Plus, Princeton Snap, local brands at your art store, Jackson's, and Treacle. While at the store, look for a brush with a nice point, but don't try to force the hairs. Usually, brushes are shipped out of factory with sizing holding the bristles in their shape. You need to remove that sizing with water. The brush may also come with a protective tube. If you remove it, do not put it back on. It is not meant to be put back on the brush, and there's a good risk of damaging the hairs. If you find a nice synthetic with a good point, you can start with only one brush, something like a size 8, 10, or even 12. The other brush I would suggest to go along with the round is a flat brush, also synthetic. A size 3/8, half, or 3/4 inch would be good. I would say that the flat brush is optional. You can work with only the round brush. The size of the brush reflects mostly on how big you feel like you want to paint. When painting with watercolors, a general tip about brushes is to try to go for the largest brush that will do the job. Watercolor paint is at its best when it's laid out quickly so that it can do its thing. Making many brush strokes to cover a larger area has a risk of leaving visible brush strokes where we'd rather have a nice flat color. Paper. Here are some of the papers you can look for. Canson XL watercolor pad, Strathmore visual journal, Pentalic watercolor sketchbook, the Aqua Journal I think, and Pentalic watercolor field book. We picked our brushes, now it's time for the paper. There are many types of watercolor paper. One characteristic to pay attention to is the paper's weight. The higher the number, the thicker the paper. The most common weights are 90 pounds and 140 pounds, or 140 GSM and 300 GSM. The GSM refers to grams per square meter. It's a bit confusing since the number 140 is present in both measures and it doesn't refer to the same paper weight. If you can't check the paper yourself, a way to remember it is just to keep in mind that the higher the numbers, the thicker the paper. The second important characteristic is the paper's finish. There are 3 types of finish: rough, hot press, and cold press, which can also be labeled as NOT, N-O-T. Rough is pretty self-explanatory. It refers to a paper with a very textured surface. Hot press refers to paper that is very smooth, with hardly any texture. Cold press stands between the other two. It has a nicely textured surface, but nothing as extreme as the rough paper. There's also the composition of the paper that may come into play when choosing a paper to paint on, but I think that for a first foray into watercolors, it's not as relevant as the other 2 elements. Basically, watercolor paper can be made either from plant fibers or cotton fibers. Most of the papers I suggest here are made from plant fibers. It's usually less expensive. To choose the paper to practice on, look for 140 pounds or 300 GSM cold press paper that is within your budget. Palette. Here, almost anything will do. If you want to think more long-term, I'd suggest getting an inexpensive white plastic folding palette. These are great because they have room for mixing and for eventually adding more colors from tubes. They are sturdy and very practical. Pill containers, pill boxes, empty half pans or full pans, empty tins, clean plastic bottle caps. Look around your space for something that you think could work. It's best to find something that is not watertight, but that can still be covered to protect from dust and pet hairs. You can also check the dollar store or the recycle bin, and look on YouTube for DIY paint palettes. Since this is meant to be a way to try out watercolors, you can eventually upgrade or adjust your palette to match your preferred way to work. The climate where you live can affect your paints, make them dry faster or make them mold. If you live in a more humid climate, make sure the palette you choose has a good airflow so that drying paints won't grow mold. Also, the paints we'll use would benefit from your palette having more room than less to store them. Paints. This is where it can get extra confusing and distressing to someone new to this lovely mess. There's generally 2 ways to go about this: student paints or professional paints. But wait, why think about professional paints already if I haven't ever really tried the medium? This is a very subjective point, and I'm gonna share my opinion on the matter. If it doesn't make sense to you or you'd rather do something else, by all means feel free to do so. I generally prefer professional paints because you don't really save any money on student paint. Usually professional paints have a lot more pigments in them than student paints, so you end up using less paint for a painting than you would with student paints, so you don't really save that much money when you buy student paints. Also, I prefer the professional paints because you can easily rely on them. I don't have to question myself if they're gonna deliver a professional result because they are professional paints. That's basically why I choose professional paints. Also, they usually have a much larger range of colors than you would find in a student range. Also, what I'm suggesting here in terms of paints is basically free. To start with watercolors, I suggest getting your hands on Sennelier's very generous free sample set. Here is the standard sampler set from most companies. You can swatch out the color, but not do much else. Here is the sampler set from Sennelier. This is actual paint in a small packet. We'll see shortly just how much paint, but already I can tell that this is enough to paint quite a few things and really experiment with the paints. The best way to get this sampler set is through your local art store. If they stock Sennelier watercolors, chances are that they have the samples too. If they don't have it, you could always ask if they plan on ordering some with their next Sennelier paints order. I'm also suggesting Sennelier as a starting brand for many reasons. Their colors are absolutely gorgeous and vibrant. Just look at this chart that comes with the samples. It's so bright. Sennelier has a fairly limited number of paints available, about 100, so you can't get too lost in the colors here. It's available both in dry pans and tubes, which can come in handy later on. The colors in the sample set are Sennelier Yellow Light, made with pigment PY153, Opera Rose, made with pigment PR81:1, and Cinereous Blue, made with pigments PB15:3 and PW4. Also, their paints are good either for layering or for more simple techniques, so you have the freedom to experiment and play with the medium. It's also a high quality paint crafted by expert hands with quality ingredients. Using these paints is my suggestion. If you have another idea or another plan, or access to some other supplies that you'd rather work with, again, it's your call. Sun dries. You'll also need some sort of container for water and a few clean rags or old towels. You can check the recycle bin for your container and just make sure everything you use is clean, both the container and the rags. Setup. So here's our tools. We'll set everything up and start painting in a week or so. Why a week? Why not now? These lovely paints are tube paints, wet paint. Wet watercolor paint is great to work with, but also much harder to control. Watercolor has this pretty awesome feature that when it's dry, it can be reactivated with water. Not the best for a finished painting, but quite awesome when it's about blobs of paint in a palette. That's what I suggest doing, squeezing the paints in your palette of choice and letting it to air dry for about a week. Try to keep the palette open for this step and out of reach of children and pets. Since our paints are by Sennelier and they feature honey in their composition, they will never be absolutely dry to the touch. Indeed, paints with honey in them tend to remain sticky to the touch. They are also much easier to re-wet, which is gentler on your brushes. The process here will be fairly simple. We'll just remove the packets from the packaging. That includes removing the tacky glue behind them. Make sure you're on a protected surface because you don't want to risk staining your work surface. Also make sure you have paper towels nearby and water as well, just to be safe. We will just open the packets and pour the paints in our palette. As I've said, the packets they include a lot more paints than I expected, so instead of my original idea to have them with one empty compartment in between, I decided to opt for a bit more space. So I will split the content into two compartments, and that can come in really useful later, so you can have one compartment that the paint stays clean and the other one that you can use a dirty brush in to create mixes more easily. If you use this kind of white folding palette, the packets will fill 2 compartments perfectly. I would again suggest to keep one empty compartment in between the colors so that there is less risk of having a color being contaminated when you mix. It's kind of a buffer. The upper rose came out a bit more solid than the blue. The blue was fairly liquid, so if you have the same kind of situation going on, you just use a toothpick and you wet it in the water and you use it to mix and stir up the paint so that it spreads better in the compartment. Try to not have any paint that goes over the walls of the section, because when you fold the palette that could really go everywhere, so just try to keep it level and not too full, which is why I suggest having it in 2 compartments. So as you can see, the blue was really liquid and spread nicely on its own. The pink was the stiffer of the 3 colors, and the yellow was in between but still needed a bit of mixing to be flat in its compartment. So about these 3 colors, you may have noticed that they are the same that comes with the printer cartridges if you have a color printer. We have one that's fairly cyan, one that's yellow, and our pink is perhaps a bit more pink than it is magenta, but that's still the basic idea of this primary set. So we do not have a black. We will work around that, and we will talk more about black later. That's why this set is not what you'd expect from a primary set. Some people would expect it to be yellow, red and blue, and this one is yellow, cyan and magenta. We'll also wash out the sizing from our brushes so that they are ready to use. I gently soak the bristles in lukewarm water and let the brush rest for a bit. Then I come back to check if it has loosened. Brushes are beautiful tools. They deserve a bit of care and gentle hands. Number 1 tip about brushes: always leave them to dry flat, or, ideally, bristles down. Try to never leave them in the water. That will mess up the ferrule and the handle pretty bad. As you can see here with my process of removing the sizing from these brushes, I take my time and I'm very careful to not force the hairs to bend. I press gently on my finger to see how bending they are, and if they are still too stiff, too hard to bend, I will again dip them in the water and wait a bit. These are not the brushes I will use later on. Since I have a nice collection of brushes, I've already cleaned up and used the ones I will be using for the next video, but I still wanted to show you the process of removing the sizing from new brushes. I've had brushes who took a lot of time to become soft. I've had brushes that were pretty instantly soft after one rinsing, so it really depends. Just make sure you take your time and you do it well. You're gonna be much more happy with your brushes if you take your time. This is particularly important if at some point you decide to get natural hair brushes. You can be a bit rougher with synthetics, just a bit, but it's really best to take your time and be extra careful when you have natural hair brushes. These are really precious and limited, so if you get natural hair brushes, make sure you take really good care of them. Once all that is done, set it aside in a place that's out of the way. We'll pick this up next week and paint our first few things with these lovely colors. I would like to thank the really awesome people at Savoir-Faire for being my collaborators on this video series. Savoir-Faire is the exclusive importer of Sennelier in the US and Canada, as well as other fine art materials. They don't sell directly to artists, but they partner with retailers all over North America. So check your local art store for these beautiful Sennelier paints. Thank you very much for watching. See you soon!